From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Majority Democrats in the Washington House and Senate have rolled out their proposed updates to Washington's two-year budget. This year's supplemental budget is the subject of close attention because lawmakers are trying to solve for a roughly $2 billion shortfall between anticipated revenues and anticipated spending. So where are they planning to cut? What taxes will they rely on? And what will it take to reconcile their differences? In our second half, we'll get reaction from the ranking Republican on the Senate Ways and Means Committee. But joining me first is the chair of that committee, Senator June Robinson. Welcome back to the program. Good to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
I'm sure this is like a pretty exhausting time of year for you. So
it is.
Thanks for being here. Before we begin, here's a quick look at the Senate Democrats' proposal. It does propose to spend $79.4 billion. That's an increase of $2.3 billion over the current baseline budget. That includes $1.73 billion in maintenance level increases and about $500 million in policy increases. The budget also factors in $2.4 billion in savings over 4 years and $2.9 billion in taxes over 4 years, most of that attributable to a proposed income tax on people making more than $1 million a year. The budget also relies on taking $750 million from the state's rainy day fund. I want to start with trying to figure out the Olympia math here because we've been hearing about this gap that needs to be closed, and yet this budget spends more. In fact, it pushes the two-year budget over the $80 billion mark. So how are you spending more if you've got a budget shortfall?
Good question. It's all wrapped up in what we call maintenance level, which is the cost of carrying out current policies that we have not changed, but things like inflation in K-12, changes in caseloads, the number of people, or the cost of providing services to those folks like Medicaid. The costs are increasing significantly. More people are using the Washington College Grant Scholarship. More folks are using Working Connections childcare, and the cost of doing that is increasing. So it's those maintenance level costs that are really driving that increase.
How do you justify in tight budget times growing the budget rather than finding ways to achieve some savings to then cover those costs?
We do have savings in our budget. So it's a balance of costs, which, as I just described, are built in, and then finding savings to sort of offset that.
Let's start with education. It is the paramount duty of the state. Your budget cuts K-12, I think, by about $144 million. According to a Republican analysis I read, this is the first budget in which K-12 and higher ed combined do not reach 50% of the budget. And in fact, K-12 drops to 42%. Higher ed, they say, is at an all-time low of 7.6%. Given that K-12 in particular is the paramount duty, how do your fellow Democrats explain that to voters and taxpayers, justify that percentage slide?
It's a percentage slide of the overall budget, but it is the number, the sheer dollars going out for K-12 continue to grow, as I said earlier.
Although, again, I just said it's a $144 million cut to K-12.
Correct, but the inflationary increase, which is baked into statute, would be hundreds of millions of dollars more than that. So there is still more money going out to K-12 than in previous budgets, even with the declining percentage and the reductions that we made. We can't touch what's defined as basic education. That is constitutionally protected. So the reductions are add-ons to basic education. Primarily they come in the Transition to Kindergarten program, which is a new program that we sort of have been starting in the last few years, and it's very popular. It's very successful. There's no doubt about that. But we are just needing to find a way to sort of right-size state dollars going into that program. And then another area that I will certainly admit is controversial is around local effort assistance, which is funding that we send out. It's just general fund dollars that we send out to what are considered property poor districts that aren't able to completely fund their operations through their property tax levies.
I think there's some particular heartburn on that one because majority Democrats, I think last year, allowed for the wealthier districts to have more local levy capacity so they can raise more. The idea was then this LEA dollars are needed even more to let the poorer districts keep up and not lose as much ground.
And we continue to send out, even with the reductions, they will be getting additional funding. We did pull back on the inflationary increase in that bundle, but all districts will continue to get additional LEA funds.
I know you said that, for instance, the transition to kindergarten money is not considered part of the kind of core basic ed, and yet about half of kindergartners show up not ready to be in kindergarten yet. Mm-hmm. So why is that program getting a cut and maybe not something over in human services or some other area of the budget?
It's an example of a program that is very popular, and again, it's a great program. At this moment in time, it is hard to fund in our state budget. And we do cut human services as well. It's all of that balancing of, do you provide health care for people? Do you provide behavioral health? Do you fund food benefits? Or, how many children are you going to pay for to go to TTK, transition to kindergarten?
Just a last question about education. Larry Delaney, who's the president of the State Teachers Union, said in a statement, "At a time when our students need more, the House and Senate budget proposals give them less." He says the legislature hasn't fully funded basic ed or special ed, and he says education, again, as a percentage of the budget, continues to decline. What would you say to Larry Delaney, the teachers out there, the parents, the students? And there's about 1 million students in Washington State's public schools.
Right. I would say that we continue to work hard to push out as many dollars as we possibly can to K-12 education, and we've made huge strides in the time that I've been in the legislature for funding both basic education and special education. The last few years, we've really dedicated billions of dollars just to special ed. So we continue to make progress. What they're talking about is compared to the overall pot of the billions of dollars that we are sending out for K-12, it's a relatively tiny reduction this year.
I want to move on to taxes. In particular, the fact that your budget and the House budget both include this new proposed income tax on people making more than $1 million. Even though that tax has not passed the legislature, has not been signed by the governor, is likely to be challenged at the ballot, and is also likely to be challenged in court. Now, I realize you're not banking it for this biennium, but what is the justification for including revenue from this tax in out years? Because you have to balance over 4 years.
Our budgeting philosophy is, if a bill has passed the Senate floor, we book it, reference it in our budget, and that bill has passed off the Senate floor. So I felt like it was appropriate. I felt like it would have been disingenuous to not include it. We know it is likely to have challenges along the way if it does get to the governor's desk this year. We went through that same scenario with the capital gains tax. The courts said that we can continue to spend and depend on that revenue even while the capital gains tax was being challenged. So we're sort of using that same rules of the road for this millionaires tax.
This millionaires tax is sort of blowing up Olympia at the moment. It is controversial, but is by including it in the budget, are you telegraphing that Democrats are confident that it will both withstand a vote of the people, presuming that happens, and perhaps more importantly, withstand a court challenge?
I think so. I think we are
And what gives you that
telegraphing that. Well, I think we've heard repeatedly from the people of Washington that they want us to tax wealth in this state in order to provide services for Washingtonians. And so I think that's what this proposal is doing. Whether, and I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, so certainly can't predict what will happen in the courts, but again, we passed it. We are confident that it will get to the finish line and felt like it was appropriate to book in the budget in the out years.
You also are proposing, in fact, if passed out of your committee, the elimination of a couple of tax breaks that have been on the books for quite some time, and in fact, I believe have even been extended in the past. One is for data centers, and the other is for prescription drug warehouses. Why those two taxes, and why now? And is it because data centers is now a dirty word, and maybe drug warehouses and pharmaceutical companies don't have favored status either with Democrats? What's going on?
Back up a bit. Both of those tax preferences were eliminated in the governor's budget. The data center's not the full preference, but partial, I guess you would say.
Yeah, you guys do the full elimination.
So I think that's where it started this year. The governor's budget
he kicked it off.
Included those. We had bills introduced as a part of the governor's request bills. The laws around how B&O tax is collected have changed over the years because of where the drug warehouse is located versus where the sales happen. Some would argue that the drug warehouse preference is really an outdated preference in terms of tax policy at this point in time. And the tax preference for data centers has been controversial all along the way. I know we did pass it a few years ago, but it certainly wasn't without detractors at that time, and continues to be very controversial. And as we see the effects of data centers, I do think public opinion and probably the opinion of some legislators has changed over time.
Is it fair to say, though, that the governor, by including it in his budget, sort of opened the door in the conversation in a way that maybe would not have happened unless he started it?
I think, having it included in the governor's budget definitely pushed us to consider it early. We might have gotten there on our own, but probably not as quickly as we had.
I understand the building trades. businesses that benefit from this might not be happy, but I understand the building trades unions, who are often supporters of Democrats, are also not happy, in particular about the data center piece. What's your message to them?
My message to them is that we are doing other things in the state of Washington to continue to provide jobs and boost the economy, and they have always been supportive of this. We are in a conversation, with the building trades, looking at
They've always been supportive of the
preference.
The preference, yeah.
Right, because building the data centers does bring jobs, but not so much after they're built.
One of the biggest, or in fact, it is the biggest new line item of spending in this budget, is roughly $1 billion as a down payment for rising tort claim payouts, lawsuit payouts, largely stemming from lawsuits related to the child welfare system. These have ballooned from about $58 million a decade or so ago to $500 million last year, $500 million. Lawsuits, as I understand it, are growing against the state 30% a year. How do you, as the chief budget writer in the Senate, and your fellow Democrats navigate this, especially in light of, and I just want to put this on the table, trial lawyers are among Democrats' biggest campaign supporters and are traditionally opposed to tort reform proposals. So you're putting money towards this, but you've got this kind of exploding problem. How do you solve for it?
It's very challenging. There is a strong sentiment among members of my caucus, the public, that we need to protect victims, and I don't disagree with that. At the same time, the amount of general fund dollars that we are spending and are on track to spend in the coming years is something that I feel strongly we need to do something about. It is curbing our ability to do other things that will protect children in Washington State. Think about what we could do with $500 million invested in child welfare services now, as opposed to paying out, lawsuit benefits to some folks who were harmed. I certainly am not going to at all say people were not harmed and that they are not, shouldn't be able to have their day in court, but it's a very difficult issue to navigate through.
My understanding is Washington State is quite exposed. I mean, we've waived sovereign immunity. We have joint and several liability, which, as I understand it, means the deep pocket pays. So let's say there's a traffic accident, somebody is killed or seriously injured. Let's say another driver is mostly at fault, but let's say the state is 10% or 15% at fault because of some design engineering issue. The state would still be on the hook for the largest, if the insurance isn't going to cover this, the state's going to, as the deep pocket, pay greater than its proportion of fault. So there are some reforms that could be considered that would change the state's exposure. As it happens, the Senate did take up a bill and passed a bill to make certain tort claims subject to administrative adjudication or arbitration. But I read the fiscal note, and the fiscal note basically says that there are enough loopholes in this that DSHS, at least, which is one of the largest agency and also has a lot of liability, does not anticipate it would result in any significant savings. So how should we interpret this? That you've got this ballooning problem, it makes you uncomfortable. The solution that's on the table apparently isn't going to save the state any money, and there are some other options that aren't being considered.
Yeah, I mean, there are just a lot of parties at interest here. There are victims' rights advocates. There are trial lawyers. There is there are state agencies, and there are the taxpayers of Washington who are footing this bill. And so I'm not saying that we have found the perfect solution, but it is an issue that we're going to need to continue to work through and address.
So that's one of the big spending increases. A big savings in this budget is $800 million in child care through the Working Connections Child Care Program. I understand that the Senate rejected Governor Ferguson's proposal for an enrollment cap and waitlist approach, and instead you are proposing an attendance-based model. What is the change, and how will this save $800 million? What are we doing now, and then how would it work under your proposal?
Right now, if a child is enrolled in Working Connections Child Care and attends at all, the provider gets paid for the entire month.
So they could go 3 days a month.
Correct.
And the provider's getting paid for
the month.
For 20 days a month.
And I will say, as a mom, I paid monthly for childcare for when my kids needed it. That was a long time ago, but it is a monthly fee typically. What the policy that is reflected in our budget is if you attend up 1 to 15 days of the month, the provider gets paid for 15 days. And beyond that, they will get paid per day. So if you attend 16 days, they get paid for 16 days and so on. So that's the policy that that's in our budget. The House has a slightly different one, so we'll need to figure that out in conference.
What do you think the impact will be on providers who have been accustomed to this being paid on a monthly basis? And on the flip side, if this saves money and we were paying for kids not necessarily to be in care, why wasn't the state doing this all along? Sort of two coins of the realm.
Yeah, I think my understanding is that this was put in place a few years ago to really, during the pandemic in particular, when we were just having trouble with childcare. We always have trouble with childcare, but particular scarcity of childcare, and for our workforce that needed to go to work during the pandemic and really needed childcare. And so it was put in place always with good intentions of boosting the workforce of childcare. And, again, we're just at a time where we need to look at across the board, kind of what are we doing? Is there a way to still offer that service and do as least harm as possible, but kind of pull back some of the appropriations?
Do you think it'll put any providers out of business?
I don't know. I'm not close enough to that industry. Obviously, some will see reduced income, whether they change behavior, change their business model, change practice. I can't say.
There have been allegations of fraud in childcare, subsidized childcare, in other states, including Minnesota. Is that something that your committee is scrutinizing? Are you asking questions about the extent to which there might be fraud in our system? And is it being rooted out? Are cases being referred? Are we ensuring that that's not happening?
The DCYF, the agency that oversees Working Connections childcare, has regular audits, and I know the Human Services Committee has held many hearings on this issue. I don't think there is fraud in our state. I think that we have a handle on who's providing childcare and how they're providing it.
Okay, that is it's a big statement. No fraud?
I don't think there's significant fraud.
Okay. You mentioned a minute ago a difference between the House and the Senate regarding how you handle this. Another, perhaps the biggest difference, is in the way that the House proposes to divert about $330 million from the Climate Commitment Act to expand the working family tax credit or rebate program. You don't do that in your budget. I know you've said that caused some heartburn with members of your caucus, the idea of taking climate commitment dollars and using it for that purpose. If this is going to be the biggest sticking point, let's say, and what is otherwise, I think you guys are fairly aligned, how are you going to work through that one?
I'm not sure yet.
Is this a split the baby situation?
Just to be
is
clear,
this an either or?
It's not an expansion of working families tax
It's just
credit. It's paying for the
gotcha.
costs, yeah.
The governor wants to expand working families tax
Through
credit
the
with the
millionaires tax,
high
yeah,
income earners
right.
tax. So how do you begin to navigate this one, though? What does that conversation look like? I
think we need to sit down and talk about what each of us really cares about in this space and find a path through.
Can you accept some diversion of CCA dollars for this purpose? Or is this a non-starter?
If that's the way that we finish, we may do that.
What is the justification for tapping into the rainy day fund when, again, the budget is growing, not declining?
Mm-hmm. I would have had a really difficult time writing a budget this year without using the rainy day fund. We are in an economic situation where we've had declining revenue forecasts for 3 of the 4 quarters, most recent quarters. We've had less than 1% employment growth for the past year, which allows us to use rainy day fund dollars with 50%. The people, previous legislators who put in place the rainy day fund and the rules around it contemplated the economic environment that we're in today. And yes, the budget is growing for reasons I've explained around increasing costs of doing business as a state. It would have been extremely challenging, and we would have had to do very harmful cuts in order to not use it.
Is it the responsible thing to do? I note that you will have a ending fund balance deficit of $900 million in the first year of the next biennium, but then the expectation is that would rebound by 2029. What makes you confident there will be a rebound? How can we justify going into deficit territory in terms of that ending fund balance?
The ending fund balance in 2029 is largely because of the revenue from the millionaires tax that's booked.
Which
there.
also, as I noted a few minutes ago, hasn't passed or survived a vote of the people or the courts. So I guess I'm just wondering, how is this budget not potentially setting us up? And I just had the treasurer on, who's very concerned about healthy reserves and the state's credit ratings and bond ratings. How is this budget not potentially setting us up for a fall of a significant nature if that money doesn't come in?
If that money doesn't come in, we have many difficult years ahead, no doubt about it.
And is there a backup plan or a
We will work
parachute
we will
cord
work,
you're going to
We
pull?
will work through that when we get there.
So with less than a minute to go, how would you sum up this budget and what you're trying to do with it, understanding the criticisms you've heard both from allies, from Republicans, as well as appreciation, I suppose? I think you said the hearing you thought was mostly appreciative, some criticism. But what are you trying to do with this supplemental budget?
I'm trying to protect the people of Washington. We wrote this budget with the backdrop of a hostile federal government that is unpredictable and cutting services for the people of Washington. And they're looking to us to help for a lifeline. And we can't completely do that, but I feel like we did the best that we could with the resources available to us to protect services that people depend on in our state.
Okay, we'll stop there. Senator June Robinson, the chair, the very busy chair of the Ways and Means Committee. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate you answering the
Thank you.
questions. When we return, the Republican perspective on the supplemental budget. We'll be back right after this.
Each week on The Impact, we find stories that affect your life and we dig in. From schools to crime to where your taxes go, we bring in the people who make state policy and find out what's really at stake. You'll get both sides of the story and you'll hear straight from the people in power. Join us Wednesday nights at 7 and 10 or anytime online at tvw.org for in-depth coverage you won't find anywhere else.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me now to discuss the state's supplemental budget and Democrats' proposals for rebalancing the budget is Senator Chris Gildon, the ranking Republican on the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Welcome to the program. Nice to see you. Let me just start with a top-line reaction to what you've seen from the Senate, from the House. I know you're not writing the budget. You're definitely in the minority. Although, if I remember correctly, last year there was some involvement with Republicans in writing the Senate budget. And support there. I don't believe you supported the final budget, but what's your takeaway?
Well, if you remember back to last year, we did offer a standalone budget called the Save Washington budget. We were at the time about $7.5 billion in the hole. And so we got together with staff and Senator Nikki Torres and I, and we actually wrote a full, complete, comprehensive budget that fully funded government with no cuts to services, no new taxes, and it bridged the budget gap. And we offered that on the floor of the Senate 2 times, and each time the majority party voted it down. Now we fast forward this year, just after they passed, record-breaking $12.5 billion in new taxes for state and local. Just last year, and we find ourselves in another budget deficit. It seems to be this never-ending cycle that we're in, where we have a budget shortfall, and then you've got to find new revenue or make cuts, because we never bend the cost curve over time. We continue with maintenance level spending going higher and higher each and every year without any real look at what's driving it and if some of the maintenance level costs perhaps need to be adjusted. But all in all, the budget as I see it, it's built on a shaky foundation, right? It's like a house of cards. It relies on one-time revenue to fix ongoing costs, and it just kind of hopes that either one, the income tax will come in and save the day in the end, or that the economy will just get better and things will naturally adjust. But I certainly don't think that legislating and budgeting on hope is a method.
You know, you mentioned the maintenance level spending. Democrats definitely point to that and say our costs are increasing faster than anticipated, and that's really putting us in a pinch. And then they will say, and look, President Trump and the Republican Congress have come in and passed H.R. 1 and done other policies that now the state has to sort of compensate for, including setting up an IT system to be able to track people on Medicaid, for instance. What's wrong with that analysis? What's wrong with that prescription of what's happened here to this budget?
Yeah, sure. And I'll give you just a little example about this. Maintenance level spending includes things like state Medicaid. If you recall, just a year ago, the state auditor came out with a report where he found about 130,000 people in our state were concurrently enrolled in Medicaid in Washington state, as well as in another state. So both states were paying the monthly premium. That's certainly a waste of taxpayer dollars, but that's baked into maintenance level spending. We don't think that should be the case. We think we should go in, clear out the rolls, make sure that only people who are eligible to be on Washington State Medicaid are in Washington State Medicaid. And that's just an example of some of the things, that real reforms that Senate Republicans are interested in making that would help alleviate this constant budget pressure.
What about sort of outside, and that's a specific example, but the inflation pressures that exist, the rising caseloads in some, not all areas, the impacts of federal policy? Mm-hmm. Do you count these as real factors that if you were writing the budget, you would also be seeing as pinch points or pressure points?
Sure. Well, let's break it down a little bit. So there's typically three big buckets that the state has to pay for in maintenance level spending. One is educate, then medicate, then incarcerate. If you look at each one of those buckets, the caseload has not gone up. As a matter of fact, we have fewer students attending K-12 schools, public schools, than we had prior to 2020. We fund K-12 largely on enrollment, so caseload's not driving cost there. If you look at Medicaid, we have fewer people on state Medicaid than we had prior to 2020. And then incarcerate, we certainly have fewer people in our state facilities. So cost should typically be going down. Yes, maybe in some circumstances, the cost per individual has gone up, but largely the number of people using state services in those larger buckets has gone down. But some of the policies we think are just moving in the wrong direction. For example, there's a need for additional bed capacity at some of our state prisons called close custody, a higher level of security.
Used to be called maximum security, or is that just a
Not
step below?
Not quite maximum, but just a step below.
Yeah.
And the proposal is to open up additional bed capacity. But if you peel back the onion and you look at why is the need for those higher custody, close custody beds, why do we need that? Well, it's because so many people inside of our corrections facilities are getting caught with drugs and drug paraphernalia. So I don't think that the solution is to spend $40 million to open up additional beds. I think what we need to do is invest in some canine units, some drug scanners, and get those into our state facilities to prevent the drugs from getting there in the first place. But so it's just, are you solving the problem, or are you just alleviating a symptom?
In my introduction, I noted that the current budget is about $78 billion. The Senate budget pushes that up over $79 billion. It's an increase of more than $2 billion in spending. If Republicans were in charge, if Republicans were writing the budget, and if you didn't want to resort to taxes, and if you wanted to hold the line on spending, you mentioned Medicaid fraud. I don't know how quickly you could realize those savings if you were to, run through the rolls. But what would you not be doing that they're trying to do in this budget?
Well, I think I can find one area of agreement with the Senate budget, and that is the savings that they achieve with the Working Connections Child Care.
Which is a chunk of money, $800 million.
And I co-sponsored that bill with Senator Robinson, my counterpart in the Ways and Means Committee. And I think that's a real legitimate savings because, I don't see any real reason that we should pay for 22 days of child care if a child is only attending 1 or 2 days. And so moving that from 22 days down to 15 days is a move in the right direction, and that's something that I certainly support. But I think you've got to look at legitimate savings such as that.
Where else would you get, let's say you wanted to cut $2.3 billion out of this budget. Where else would you go? Where else would you look?
Oh my goodness, where would you? I would look under every nook and cranny. I mean, the budget is so large, and the problem is we just never look at maintenance level spending. One of the things that happens is once an item gets baked into maintenance level, it just gets funded, and then it goes up by inflation every year, and we never really look at it. And that's one of the reasons why I sponsored a bill earlier this year that would require additional reporting requirements from the state's fiscal website, the LEAP website. For example, the Office of Women and Minorities under the governor's office, it was created just a few years ago. Since then, the legislature has increased funding to it 2 times. And right now, if you go on the state's fiscal webpage to see how much we're spending for that agency, you can't find the data because it's just rolled into the maintenance level under the governor's office. And so I think the public should be able to go in and explore and research how much agencies are growing, in detail, not just rolled up under the large umbrella of each agency.
Are there other policy decisions that Democrats are making in this budget? You've talked a lot about maintenance level, but are there other spending line items in here that you think either are not appropriate given the budget situation we're in, or are antithetical to sort of Republican values? What are they doing here that you disagree with?
Well, I think it's, number one is just the level of spending, right? It just seems to be unrestrained, and it has been for a number of years. If you look at the budget since 2018, I think the state budget has basically doubled since 2018. That's twice the rate of family households. So I think a policy level thing that I would embrace is a limitation on how much government can grow. So for example, put in a policy or a constitutional amendment that says government may only grow by the average increase to median wage worker growth, right? And then any revenues that come in beyond that roll back into a tax return for property taxes or whatever you may choose, but give it back to the people and limit the state's growth to, CPI or worker wage growth, just to curb the appetite for spending in Olympia. The appetite for spending is just never ending.
I asked Senator Robinson about the proportion or portion of this budget, the percentage of this budget that goes towards education. Yeah. Republicans have noted that this is a decline overall, percentage-wise, that goes to both K-12 and higher ed. In fact, I think the analysis is that K-12 and higher ed budget growth over 10 years has been about 55%, while everything else has grown over about 125%. That said, and it is, of course, K-12 is the paramount duty, but Republicans have also been concerned about the deliverables from K-12, the results we're seeing, and declining test scores, for instance. So, again, if you were writing the budget, what would you be doing in terms of funding for education in light of the concerns that Republicans have also expressed about the deliverables?
Yeah, so you mentioned the statistic, the 42% or whatever it was. That's a little bit tricky because that implies that we are not funding K-12 education. And, I think that we are funding K-12 education largely to a very good degree.
You think you're meeting the constitutional mandate?
I believe that we are. Now, where I believe we're falling short is in demanding results from our schools to make sure that our kids who are graduating from our public schools are workforce ready, they're college ready, they're ready for that next phase of their life. Whenever we fall below certain other states, I think it's Mississippi in reading, that's a problem, especially given the type of workforce that we're trying to develop here in Washington State, which is very tech savvy, a very literate workforce is what we're known for. We should be demanding from our schools results. And not just from our schools, but I think any time that we have legislation come up in Olympia, and this has been a passion point of mine, anytime that a bill comes up and it's spending money on a program or creates a new program, it should have measures of performance and measures of effectiveness built into that program that forces some type of way to measure if the program is meeting its intended objectives or not. And it should have a review time that forces us to review it or sunset the program.
What is your view of the specific cuts in K-12 that are in the Senate budget, including the local effort assistance to the poorer school districts, the property tax poor districts, I should say, and the cut to the transition to kindergarten program, limiting it only to kids on free and reduced lunch?
Yeah, I think that's problematic. The transition to kindergarten program is one of the least costly forms of childcare that we have, if you compare it to ECAP or Working Connections childcare. I think cutting that is probably a move in the wrong direction, and then reducing the local effort assistance as well. I think a proposal that you may see come up as an amendment to the budget is switching that so that you take a little bit of more of a cut from Working Connections childcare in order to fund the transition to kindergarten program and increase the local effort assistance.
Do you think you could get bipartisan support, or would that be a bipartisan amendment, or at this point would it be a Republican amendment?
We'll see. We'll see. We're supposed to be voting that out of committee tomorrow on Wednesday, and that amendment will come up for a vote, and we'll be working it between now and then.
How would you save more money in the Working Connections child care program? Would you go down in terms of the number of days you're paying for?
Right. So you would move from, say, 15 days down to 10 days. And then that would give you sufficient amount of money that you could fund all of those transition to kindergarten slots as well as the local effort assistance.
Why don't you give us a flavor of some other amendments that Republicans will be offering? Do you have anything else off the top of your head that...
Oh, I might keep you in suspense for a little while, Austin.
Anything else, though, that sort of comes to mind that, there's an opportunity from your perspective? You may not like the overall budget, but if you want to make some adjustments here and there, anything else that you'd be proposing?
Yeah, and we're definitely still coming up with our total strategy for which amendments we're going to be offering in committee versus which amendments that we're going to be offering on the floor on Friday, I believe, when it's going to come up for a vote. So stay tuned. It'll be fun.
I want to ask you about the high earners income tax proposal that is moving through the legislature, but also baked into both of these budgets.
Yeah.
I asked the senator what the justification for that was, and she gave her answer. What is your view of the fact that that is contemplated, again, not for purposes of balancing the current two-year budget, but in the out years?
Right. Well, let's just go back to the big picture strategy of why we're hearing this bill this year. And it does nothing to help the current budget, so that's not the reason why. The real reason that this is before us this year is because the majority party wants to enact a progressive income tax across the board to every person in Washington state. They cannot do that currently because the Supreme Court said that income is property and property must be taxed uniformly. So they could enact an income tax at 1% or 2% or whatever percentage that they say just by a simple majority vote right now. But their goal is to enact a progressive income tax in our state, and they're limited. They can't do that. So my opinion is they want to pass this bill this year in order to get it before the Supreme Court and have the Supreme Court overturn their ruling that says income is property and it must be taxed uniformly.
There has been some talk of a constitutional amendment to enshrine and lock in this threshold. Would Republicans lend, that would take a 2/3 vote, would Republicans lend their votes to a constitutional amendment on this topic?
It's a really politically tricky one, right? Because if the income tax is going to pass,
which it appears it will.
So if it's going to pass, would you use your vote to ensure that people below that income threshold are permanently protected?
This is the question I am asking.
This is the big question, and we will have to caucus on that, and then we'll figure that one out.
What would, I mean, you said it's politically tricky, but what would be the reason not for doing that? If the writing is on the wall here, and of course, if it's thrown out by the voters or thrown out by the, by the courts, it's sort of a moot point, but why wouldn't Republicans, if your concern is that this is a camel's nose under the tent, and that really this tax is coming for, the guy behind the tree,
Right.
why not come together and say, we will lend the votes to get a constitutional amendment that ensures that never happens?
Well, I guess the question is, do you, as a Republican who is fiscally conservative in most cases, do you want to lend your name to an income tax, right? That's the big question. So are you willing to lend your name to the income tax, or is that just too risky of a move for you?
Even if it means protecting, quote unquote, protecting the taxpayers that you think this tax is coming for.
Politics is tricky.
What about the elimination of the tax preferences for data centers and for, what's the other one? The prescription drug warehouses. Let's start with the data centers. I mean, data centers are in the news every day, all the time right now because of AI. They're being built across the country. There's a lot of controversy around them. There are efforts to try to protect ratepayers and water sources because of the energy and water demands of these things. We've also had this tax break on the books for quite some time. Now it's being proposed to be eliminated. What do you think?
Yeah, so let's differentiate between data centers. So you have your rural data centers that are occupied by one tenant, like Microsoft, Amazon, really large facilities, mostly
like
on the
the one
east
out
side.
on Quincy that
Correct.
Microsoft has.
And then you also have your urban data centers. The tax incentive that's being removed, or the original bill as it was removing the tax incentive for the urban centers for the replacement of the equipment, the server stacks within those centers. And I'll give you an example of, I have a data center in Puyallup, believe it or not.
In your district?
In my district, and I really worked to get that tax exemption passed over the course of a number of years. And when I first visited that data center, it's this huge facility, a couple of football fields in size. It had maybe 5% occupation by server stacks. Once we got that tax exemption and we were able to compete on equal footing with Oregon and other states, I visited it just this last summer. That place is almost at max capacity now. People are coming in, they're investing in our state, in our data centers. For example, we had one tenant in particular that invested $500 million into the Puyallup data center just over the last couple of years, and they did so specifically because that tax exemption existed. So I think it's very short-sighted to forego all of that investment in the name of saving, I think it's $120 million one time. I just had $500 million investment into my community for one tenant, one data center alone. So I think that's very short-sighted.
You mentioned the sort of larger, more rural data centers with sort of one anchor tenant versus these more commercialized settings in the more urban areas. Does the elimination of the tax break have any implication for
So the original bill, as the bill was originally proposed, it did not. However, there was an amendment in Ways and Means that made it apply to all data centers.
The governor initially had the narrower, and now
Correct.
Yeah.
Now
So are you're opposed to both the elimination of the tax preference that addresses the equipment in your backyard data center, but also to what? Is the other half of this for new data centers?
It's for existing data centers as well, all data centers across the board.
So you would say keep this on the books?
Keep it on the books as it is.
What about these?
And the other thing is, we've had businesses choose to invest in these data centers and in our communities and bring their businesses, bring their employees into our communities in good faith that that tax exemption exists. So I think if you remove that exemption, you are operating in bad faith as a government.
Of course, one of the arguments is that these data centers take a lot of workers to build, but once they're built, don't need a lot of people to run them.
Well, I tell you what, we've got good paying jobs in the Puyallup data center for sure.
What about the elimination of the tax break for the prescription drug warehouses? I think it's 3 giant multinational companies that benefit from this, who are in this business.
Well, I mean, I'll just be very brief with this is if you eliminate that exemption, costs for medication are going to go up. That's just the way it's going to happen.
The additional nearly $1 billion as a down payment for rising tort costs, is that appropriate? How would Republicans address this growing liability?
Yeah, it is definitely a problem. If we do not take some action on that this year, in just a couple of years, our liability for this tort liability is going to be more than we pay for University of Washington and Washington State University combined. It is the fastest growing item in our budget right now, I believe. And one of the things that really got it was whenever the statute of limitations came off, and so now we have cases dating back 10, 20, 25 years. And it's really hard for the state to defend itself with those cases that are really old because, paperwork is missing, people's memories have faded. And so a lot of times in those cases, the state is just settling. And the proposal on the table now is to send that to some type of an arbitration in order to try to settle some of those older cases. I think that's probably an appropriate way to move forward, but the legislature will make its ultimate decision.
Would Republicans go further? I asked Senator Robinson about pulling back some of the state's exposure, being more aggressive in trying to lower that. The fiscal note on that arbitration bill, as I said, as I read it, Department of Social and Health Services assumes that this will not result in any significant change in current process and result in no fiscal impact. I mean, why would Senate Democrats and Republicans pass a bill that's not likely to address the fiscal problem here, which is the ballooning tort payouts?
I don't know that I agree with their assessment on that fiscal note, quite honestly. I do believe that it will have an effect and a positive effect to the state budget as people choose to go through the arbitration. And
would you support caps on payouts?
I mean, that's certainly something to consider. The thing that I want to protect, though, is a person's ability to seek, to get into court and to have their day and their voice heard. I don't want to take that away from anyone, no matter if the case was 15 or 20 years ago. Everyone needs to have their voice heard.
I want to end on the ending fund reserves, the tapping into the rainy day fund and the amount that's left in reserves under this proposed budget. As I noted to Senator the chair, there is an ending fund balance deficit in the first out year. They are counting on this income tax to kick in and make them whole again. They're tapping into the rainy day fund to the tune of about $750 million. Appropriate, inappropriate? What's your thinking?
Inappropriate. I don't think you should budget based off of hope. You budget based off of your priorities. And just as we did just last year with the Save Washington budget, where we were able to cover $7.5 billion worth of a shortfall, fully fund government, no cuts to services, no increases to taxes. If you dig in to the budget and you're serious about it, you can find real reforms, structural reforms. For example, I'll give you another one, is juvenile rehabilitation. Right now, if you're up to age 25, you're going to juvenile facility as opposed to the Department of Corrections. Well, juvenile rehabilitation costs about $260,000 per year per person. Department of Corrections cost about $60,000 per person. You can make some real savings if you just make reforms such as that.
Okay, I do have to stop you there. Senator Chris Gildon, the ranking Republican on the Senate Ways and Means Committee. Thanks for coming in and talking about the budget.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.